Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the right to food in Europe, Alliance to Guarantee Access to Sustainable Food for All. I'm Pilar Martinez, Program Manager. Program Manager in the area of sustainable food at the Daniel and Nina Carasso Foundation. For those who don't know us, we are a philanthropic foundation committed to the transition towards a greener, more inclusive and fulfilling society through two axes, art and citizenship, to develop critical thinking and reinforce social bonds, and sustainable food for universal access to healthy food that is safe for people and for the ecosystems. Without a doubt, sustainable food is the basis of life, a determinant of health and well-being, and an essential objective to build a present with a view to the future. Zero hunger is precisely what Sustainable Development Goal 2 seeks to achieve: food security and improved nutrition while promoting sustainable agriculture. Unfortunately, the number of people in Europe who cannot feed themselves adequately is alarming, a reality that has been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Understanding this reality is an essential, it's essential to put in place measures to address it. We are here today to know more about the right to food in Europe and learn how different European countries measure the lived experience on food insecurity and translate these results into public policy design and by an extraordinary panel of experts. So on behalf of the Carasso Foundation, thank you to all the speakers for sharing their experience today. Thank you also to all the attendees for joining us today. Just a practical question, just remember that as you were informed in the registration form, this session will be recorded, and please feel free to write down any comment or question in the chat during the presentation. We will compile the question for the discussion. So without further delay, I'm delighted to give the floor to Olivier de Schutter, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, co-chair of IPES Food, and professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and very warm welcome to all those who could join this webinar on the right to food in Europe. It is, I think, extremely interesting to note that the right to food is an idea that, although listed already in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, has been only revived after the World Food Summit of 1996, after it was found by governments and many others that the usual approaches to combating hunger, combating food insecurity were failing. In fact, in the 1990s, people started to realize that simply increasing production, investing in technological developments to boost the ability for agronomists to increase the levels of production was not going to be sufficient to reduce the levels of hunger and malnutrition unless we also empowered people and unless governments were held accountable to their population. And in 1996, when the World Food Summit convened, it asked that the right to food be clarified in its implications, largely because of the work of an economist, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen, who in 1981, in his book, Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlement and deprivation, noted that famines did not develop in states that were generally democratic, in states in which opposition political parties could hold governments accountable, in states where civil society was organized and media in a position to criticize governmental action. And so that is when the right to food really started to be cited some 50 years almost after it was mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, for a number of years, the right to food was more frequently invoked in the global south than in rich countries. We have, for example, the most significant right to food case that started developing before the Indian Supreme Court in 2001. We have decisions from the Supreme Court of Nepal, from courts in South Africa, from courts in Colombia that refer to the right to food. We have the experience of Brazil that was the most remarkable example of the right to food being institutionalized. And now we realize that Europe is falling behind and that in European countries, the right to food is often neglected, underestimated, and certainly does not lead to the institutional developments that other countries in the global south have been able to witness. We still believe in Europe that food security can be achieved by increasing production and stabilizing prices. And we neglect the right to food as a tool to hold governments accountable. So I would like to say a few words about the right to food in Europe to emphasize how it can be a problem-solving tool, how it can be not just of symbolic value, not just even of legal importance and legal significance. It also is a tool that has very operational, practical consequences, which is one reason why it was referred to very explicitly in the Rome Summit on World Food Security that was convened in 2009 to draw the lessons from the global food price crisis of 2008. And the fact that the Carasso Foundation is convening this webinar today on the right to food in Europe at a time when the prices of food commodities are reaching unprecedented heights as a result of the increase in the prices of energy, as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, given the important role of Ukraine and Russia in providing wheat and maize and sunflower oil to the world markets. The fact that the webinar is convened today is also of significance. We are unprotected. We have not designed institutions that would be reactive enough to the rise of food prices, and the right to food is about being better protected, more resilience in the face of such a crisis. What can the right to food provide? Well, I would like to make 3 points here. Firstly, access to an adequate diet that should, of course, be a right for all individuals, men, women, and children, whatever their level of income. That may be achieved through 3 channels. First, through work. Obviously, people who work must be able to be rewarded by being provided with a living wage. And this is what Article 7 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights provides for, by referring to just and favorable conditions of work. The General Comment number 23, adopted in 2016 by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, contains a number of paragraphs, paragraphs 18 to 24, that define what is a fair remuneration, a remuneration that provides an adequate standard of living to the worker, allowing the worker and the members of his or her family to have access, inter alia, to an adequate diet. So that is the first channel through which the right to food can be effectively protected. It is by ensuring that people who work are paid decent wages, allowing them to meet the necessities of life, inter alia, the need to have access to adequate diets, in addition to being able to pay for energy, for mobility, for housing, for education, for healthcare, etc. This is important because it shows that the right to food can be one parameter, one tool to define the levels of minimum wage in minimum wage legislation and to guide the negotiation between social partners in collective agreements setting wages at enterprise level or at sectorial level. So that is one channel. The second channel, of course, through which the right to food can be protected is by providing social protection, economic support to those who cannot live from their work, either because they do not find work or because they cannot work for any reason. And here we have another provision of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that enters into play, and that is Article 9 on the right to social security. The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights adopted the General Comment number 19 in 2008 on the right to social security, emphasizing that the benefits provided to the population, the social security levels provided, should allow to have access to an adequate standard of living. And you define this adequate standard of living inter alia by access to an adequate diet. So this is, of course, hugely important. We have seen in many countries in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, how social protection systems still had a number of gaps, still did not provide adequate levels of protection to a number of people in society. For example, informal workers, workers who are in precarious forms of employment, part-time workers, for example, platform workers. And of course, we know that many people do not have access to work and must be supported by other means. So that is the second channel through which the right to food can be protected. The third channel is, of course, by allowing people to produce their own food. Of course, in Europe, this concerns a smaller portion of the population than in many low-income countries. But here, there is part of the right to food is a right for people to produce food and to receive support from governments in access to resources, allowing them to contribute as food producers to food security and to their own ability to feed themselves and to have access to a decent income by the food that they produce. So that is essentially how the right to food can be implemented through these three channels that show, in the way I'm describing them, show how the right to food is something that should also influence how wages are set, how social protection schemes are designed, and the levels at which social protection is provided, and how agricultural policies support food producers. And that is, of course, one first contribution of the right to food that in the European context is particularly important. The second contribution of the right to food in the European context is to democratize food systems. What we have seen over the past 10, 15 years in a number of European countries, particularly in the UK, more recently in Germany, to a limited extent in France, in Italy, and Spain, and we have some promising experiences in the Netherlands and in Belgium, is the establishment of food policy councils, fora that for one particular municipality, one particular province or territory, bring together all the different stakeholders of food systems, from the food producers, the peasants producing food, to the end consumer, but involving also local collectivities, the representatives, elected representatives at local level, bringing together the food retailers, the food processing companies, and indeed the normal average citizens who are interested in designing sustainable food systems. And these fora, these food policy councils, are a way to create trust between these actors, identify the vulnerabilities, the fragilities in food systems, and make recommendations to the elected politicians so that the food systems can be improved and become more sustainable, more resilient, and more protective of the right to food. The right to food requires that we insulate the decision-making processes from the disproportionate influence of certain powerful lobbies controlled by the major agri-food corporations. The right to food requires that the food policies that are designed in a way that is transparent, democratic, and inclusive. And this is the best way to ensure that food policies will be adopted that protect all groups of the population, including the most vulnerable segments of the population and people in poverty in particular. So food policy councils are the second contribution or way to implement the right to food in the European context. Now, usually these food policy councils are thought of at municipal level, and in cities such as Montpellier in France, Ede-Wageningen in the Netherlands, Freiburg or Köln in Germany, just to name some examples, we have quite well-functioning food policy councils at city level. But increasingly, we should think of establishing food policy councils also at higher levels of government, including at the European level. When, together with a large number of organizations, NGOs, unions, including farmers' organizations, IPES Food launched the discussion on a common food policy for the EU. At the heart of these proposals was the idea that the EU should adopt or put in place, establish a food policy council for the EU that could be hosted by the European Economic and Social Committee. And in May 2019, the European Economic and Social Committee adopted a report, in fact, one of a series of reports on moving towards sustainable food systems in Europe, in which it recommended the establishment of such an EU Food Policy Council to monitor the implementation by the European Commission of its commitments in the adoption of a European level food policy. And when in 2020, in May 2020, the European Commission announced its new food strategy from farm to fork, many NGOs and unions recalled that this institutional component was important to ensure a democratic governance of food policies and to ensure that the Commission and other actors would be held accountable for results. So that is, in my view, the second contribution the right to food can make. It's to democratize food systems. The third contribution, finally, is to establish, under the auspices of the right to food and using the right to food as a compass, to establish a governance system that facilitates the transition from the current situation to sustainable food systems. Now, such a transition requires that we adopt multi-year action plans to move towards sustainable food systems in a way that is coordinated across different sectorial policies, and that this transition over a number of years is carefully monitored by the use of indicators allowing to measure progress and to hold governments accountable for the progress they make or for their lack of progress. It is extremely important to have such a governance of transition in order to escape the tyranny of the short term and to ensure that we don't simply make decisions based on the need to react to the existing crisis or the sudden developments that food systems go through, but that we maintain a focus on the end objective, which is to create sustainable food systems that can feed the population in ways that are environmentally sustainable and contribute to human health, to animal health, and to the health of the soils. To do this, we need to plan the transition over a number of years, and that requires to put in place monitoring bodies that will ensure that progress is done at a sufficient speed using various indicators to measure progress, so that governments are not allowed to remain passive. This kind of governance tool is one that will allow us not to remain hostage to the short term, and it is this kind of tool that the food strategy adopted by the European Commission, From Farm to Fork, that I mentioned already, that is part of the Green Deal announced by the European Commission in December 2019, should serve to guide us. Today, as we see the prices of wheat, of maize, of soybean go up very significantly as a result of the increased prices of energy, we realize that it is very tempting for many actors to provide their own solutions to the crisis by saying we need to increase production at all costs, as if the current crisis were the result of a mismatch between supply and demand, rather than the result of speculation on food markets, the result of high energy prices, and the result of the disruptions in global supply chains, particularly damaging for countries who depend on imports from Russia and Ukraine. And having a food strategy in place, defining certain objectives to be reached by 2030 is a way to ensure that we will not deviate from that script, that instead we will keep on track, remain on track, and that despite the crisis requiring certain adaptations, perhaps, we will not lose sight of that end objective that was announced in May 2020 with the food strategy From Farm to Fork. So I think it is a very promising development we've witnessed with this strategy, one that illustrates the potential of the right to food in guiding the choices of policymakers. So I think this is what I wanted to say on the right to food in Europe. We still have too few courts that use the right to food as a way to assess governmental policies and to protect people who are deprived from access to adequate diets. We still have far too few national human rights institutions that refer to the right to food and use it as a reference point in their recommendations to governments and parliaments. But we are starting to see something important develop, which is the development at local level, at regional level, and at European level of food policies that cut across different sectorial policies, agricultural policies, environmental policies, health policies, employment policies, all policies that affect the food systems, define the food environment, and have to be better coordinated with one another in order to deliver results and to ultimately allow each individual to have access to an adequate diet. So that is starting to happen. Governments are realizing that it's not enough to have segmented policies in areas such as agriculture, health, education, employment, or rural development. they are starting to realize that we need to bring all these policies together under a common umbrella. And I strongly believe that the right to food can provide exactly that umbrella we need to ensure much greater coherence across different sectoral policies. And that is what we are now witnessing. That is the use we are seeing of the right to food in the European context. So that is what I would propose to start with. And I look forward to our dialogue on this issue. And I would like to thank again the Carasso Foundation for doing so much to promote these many initiatives, mostly from civil society groups rather than from governments, that move us closer to the ideal of a world in which the right to food would be fully realized. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for your intervention, for shed light and explain some different ways to achieve the right to food in Europe. We do agree that we need to implement a holistic or systemic approach to address this issue. And we have here some examples, some case studies that would share some different strategies to address the right to food in Spain, the UK, and France. So please, I give the floor to all the three case studies, and then we will have some time to discuss, to share questions and go deeper in all these issues. Thank you. Ana Morales, it's your turn. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It was great organizing this webinar and also with the Carasso Foundation and having so much interest in Europe and beyond Europe as well. And I think it is about time to strengthen our alliances around the right to food and how we can make it happen in Europe as well. So today what I'm going to present is a bit where we are at in Spain, a study that we have conducted in the University of Barcelona together with the Carasso Foundation, and then some next steps as well to continue strengthening, as I was saying, these alliances. So the first thing, just a bit kind of like highlighting some of the things that Olivier was saying. As we all know, food is at the center of the social, economic, ecological, and health challenges that we have at the moment. And I just wanted to share with you some data from Spain, what we call las colas del hambre, like the hungry queues that we have around food banks, where we have registered more than 1.5 million people using food banks from 2020 to 2021. And we also have a cost associated to the types of diets that we're following here in Spain related to deaths, like 90,000 deaths a year in Spain are related to these inadequate diets. And we have also a very high cost of treating obesity and overweight in our health system, almost 2,000 million euros a year. As in many other countries across Europe, we know that people suffering from different forms of diet-related illnesses are concentrated in households where there are lower incomes, and this is the case of childhood obesity and overweight in our country, where that happens like in lower household incomes. There are like 14 points above higher income households, and of course the environmental impact of our food systems that we're all aware of, and also the economic relevance of the food system and how it is a key aspect of the livelihoods here in Spain, but also of the global population. When we look at this together, what we can contend is that it's important to look at it in an integrated way, and therefore to advocate for sustainable food, which we define as food that is good for people, places, and the planet, and that safeguards future generations so that they can also feed themselves in a sustainable way. In some of the work that I have been doing with the city of Barcelona, we try to ground a bit what does this mean, sustainable food in practice. And the first thing is the first dimension is that sustainable food has to imply guaranteeing the right of sustainable food, guaranteeing the right of people to actually eat food that benefits them in terms of health, but it also benefits places in terms of employment, as Oliver was saying, in terms of the ecosystems, but also in terms of the planet. So in this context, where are we at in terms of the right to food in Spain? So the first thing we have to highlight is that we have a complete lack of systemic measurements. At the national level, in the national statistics, what we're actually measuring is this indicator that is very old-fashioned, and is whether a person can afford one meal with meat, chicken or fish, or the vegetarian equivalent every 2 days. That's the measurement that the government is using to have an approximation of what's going on in terms of food insecurity. Then we have independent organizations such as Caritas Foundation that develops a report every 2 or 3 years where they look at different forms of deprivation, and then they ask people about the experience of hunger and whether they can afford an adequate diet. However, these type of measurements are far away from some of the recommendations of organizations such as FAO, and using like the food insecurity experience scale. Here I have put, for those of you that are not familiar with it, I put like a little diagram of what this scale measures. And it measures basically the different types of experiences that people are living when they are in relation to food security, whether they are worried about obtaining food, whether they are compromising the quality of the food, or they are compromising the quantity, to the levels of like experiencing severe food insecurity, such as running out of food or like spending an entire day without eating. So this type of measurement, the FIES scale, is not something that we are measuring right now in Spain at the national level, but there are some organizations such as the Observatory of the Guarantee of the Right to Food in Madrid that has tried to adapt some of the data that we have there to this scale, doing some approximations, and the levels that they measure is that in 2018, more than 13% of the population in Spain had some form of food insecurity. We do have quite a lot of activity going on at the autonomous community level, and not only activity, but also there are many competences that are at this regional level. We have 17 autonomous communities, and the Basque Country, for example, it is measuring routinely these levels of food insecurity using the FIES scale. And then we have some experiences at the local level. In Madrid, they developed their own index, and in Barcelona, they also use this FAO index. And what we could see here is that more than 8% of people in Barcelona were experiencing some form of food insecurity, but we have neighborhoods such as Ciutat Vella, where more than 23% of the population were experiencing some form of food insecurity. So as you can see, we don't know where we are, but we're having an increasing movement that is advocating for trying to know where we're at and trying to change things. And we have a vibrant food movement in Spain, focusing on food sovereignty, agroecology, sure food supply chains, alternative food networks, local food, and it's establishing increasing connections to health and socioeconomic inequalities. In the last 2-3 years, it was something that it was disconnected, but there are key initiatives and processes going on, like the network of municipalities for agroecology. They have a working group on the right to sustainable and healthy food. They are developing, hosting webinars where they put many different actors together to rethink, for example, food aid, or campaigns around sustainable and healthy food for everyone. We also have an observatory in Madrid that is pushing for integrating new measurements within our national statistics, and also an observatory of the right to food in Spain, which is trying to develop a whole set of indicators around the right to food in order to see where we are at in Spain. And finally, one of the efforts that we have invested our time in the last couple of years is to have a study on the state of food insecurity in Spain that was funded by the Nina and Daniel Carasso Foundation to actually know where we're at right now. Why? Because, well, the problem of food insecurity in our country is hidden, and it's impossible to manage where we don't know, where we don't understand. As you can see here in the iceberg of the food security experience, you can see the queues at the food banks, or how many children are eligible for free school meals, but there are a lot of experiences related to food insecurity, the worry, the tiredness due to a low quality diet, the reliance on cheap food that we don't see. This is important, as Olivia was saying as well, to hold accountable governments so that Spain complies with the commitments that it has in terms of human rights, but also the SDG Zero Hunger. And the aim basically of this study was to provide scientific evidence of where we are at in terms of food insecurity in Spain before and during the COVID pandemic. And we use this FAO, this FIES methodology, plus some additional variables, and conducted a representative household survey on the phone. So what did we find in this study? We found that 33.3% of the Spanish households were experiencing food insecurity. That means more than 60.2 million people in Spain. This is this was a shocking statistics for many people, but it was even more shocking to see that not only since COVID, the levels of food insecurity were quite high, but before COVID, 11.9% of the population was experiencing food insecurity. That means that this lack of access to adequate food is a structural problem in the country. It's not all about a specific crisis that happened in a specific moment, but it's something that is happening in a continuous basis. And we can see that the increases in terms of the increases in terms of the experience of food insecurity were around eating fewer foods, fewer types of foods, eating less amount of food, and also compromising in terms of of healthy foods, as well as running out of food. So we could see like a change between before COVID and after COVID of the levels of food insecurity. And at the moment, we could say that 5.2% of the households are experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity in Spain. And this means that around 2.4 million people have reduced the quantity of food consumed due to lack of resources. And we can see that here the severe food insecurity has doubled since the start of the pandemic, the levels of severe food insecurity. We thought it was very important to also relate this to what type of households were experiencing this type of, experiencing food insecurity, and we related it to different variables. And I'm just going to give a very, very short summary of what we found in terms of the statistically significant relationships. And of course, the household in lower socioeconomic levels, so the ones that had precarious employment conditions, were the ones where more related to the incidence of food insecurity. But we can see that having employment is not enough because from the households where nobody had a precarious employment condition, more than 38% of those households reported some level of food insecurity. We also asked about health and food practices and some of the relationships that households with food insecurity were related as well with those that had people with problems of obesity or overweight, chronic illnesses and disabilities, as well as those households where they wouldn't comply with the recommendation of eating 5 a day in terms of fruit and veg, and also the restricted use of food-related infrastructure. I think this is particularly relevant in the context of increasing energy prices. We can see that in the households experiencing food insecurity, more than 18% of those households have equipment to cook or store food, but they actually restrict its use. Something that probably has increased in the last month. And another element that we're looking at is what type of support were these households receiving. And we look at support in terms of money, in terms of pensions, but also different types of support from family or neighbors and friends, and also in-kind support. So directly food or money that was directed towards buying food, such as vouchers. And here we can see how in the households experiencing food insecurity, the level of reliance on family and neighbors in terms of supporting them with money is very important. And also in terms of accessing food, for example, the households with food insecurity, 33% of them were receiving some sort of food or support to buy food from their families and also from neighbors and friends. Therefore, we can see that there's an importance of not only seeing what are the levels of food insecurity, but people experiencing that food insecurity, how are they coping, what type of strategies that are using, and how this is hiding a bigger problem that is making us, again, as I was saying before, the problem invisible. So some of the conclusions of studies is that in relation to the state of food insecurity in Spain, it is quite clear that the right to food is not guaranteed here in Spain, and we're not progressing towards the SDG 2, which is about ending hunger and achieving food security. And the food insecurity, we cannot treat it as a punctual problem, but it's a persistent problem that requires a collective response and requires structural changes. So some of the recommendations coming out of this study is the urgency to recognize and guarantee the right to adequate to sustainable food in Spain by empowering also people, so in a way that it dignifies people, to include the measurement of food insecurity levels in national statistics so that we are able to monitor, to hold the state accountable, but also to understand how we're guaranteeing this right to food. What type of solutions are we promoting? Are we relying on families? Are we relying on food banks? How we can make sure that this right to food is guaranteed in a way that is centered in people's needs and also in their dignity, and therefore design effective solutions and understand their potential impact. And to finish, I just wanted to share with you a bit what are we doing apart from developing this study and trying to push forward the importance of the right to sustainable food on public and policy agendas. Together with the study, we had a very strong communication campaign where we had a lot of digital impacts, and also the news appeared in all the main newspapers in Spain, in the printed media, and also online. So we had a lot of impact, despite that it was the same day that the war in Ukraine started. So it was a day where creating news was not easy, but it's true that there's like a real interest out there to see what's going on. And we are also working in strengthening collaborations across civil society, academics, philanthropic organizations, and policymakers. In this regard, we're working at different levels, at the local, regional, national, international levels. We're working through webinars. We are also engaged in developing food strategies. As it was mentioned before, mostly they are occurring at the local level or the metropolitan level, like for example here in Barcelona, but we are actively engaging in setting this importance of the right to food in these conversations. We're also having one-to-one and follow-up conversations with key institutions, public institutions, so that they integrate this perspective and that they start measuring it. And we are building these alliances to include the measurements in national statistics by working with different organizations. And finally, we're in the process of developing a multi-stakeholder working group that is promoted by the Carasso Foundation as part of the work on sustainable food, to continue talking about how can we promote the right to food and ensure access of everyone to sustainable food. And this is where we are at. We're really looking forward to your questions later and to learn from other experiences in other places. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Anna. So maybe we can, Rachel, give the word to Rachel so you can make your presentation.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. So we're doing a two-part presentation, myself and Anna Taylor from the Food Foundation. I thought I'd give a bit of an overview about how we reached government engaging in food insecurity measurement and monitoring in the UK. And then Anna's going to be talking about the work they've been doing on how they've been using food insecurity measurement to really push for policy change in the UK context. And complementing some of what was shared by Anna just now, I wanted to start with where we were just about 10 years ago now, so 2012, with headlines like this hitting the papers quite often. The number reporting, the numbers of people using food banks being reported, and these were statistics, headlines that were causing shock and dismay that there are this many people without enough money for food in the UK. Go forward a couple of years and the headlines were now that over 1 million people were using food banks. Now, coming from the Canadian context, I moved to the UK in 2014, and I was always a bit surprised that food bank use was really the only indication of the problem of food insecurity in the population. And never mind that there was also a lot of controversy over what these food bank statistics were showing. So infamously, we had a government minister in 2013 suggest that the numbers we were seeing in food banks were really just being driven by the supply of food banks going up over this period. We had attacks on the Trussell Trust data. So the Trussell Trust is the network of food banks that operates in the UK, and that was responsible for these numbers. They track food bank use across their network, but the stats that they were using is report on the number of times people use food banks, not the number of people. So people were questioning their data. And then there was work done by Sabine Goodwin and the Independent Food Bank Network that really pointed out that it's true, you can't just rely on numbers from the Trussell Trust Food Bank, because there are many more food banks operating outside of this network, and we need to be looking at how many people are using those food banks as well. And that's shown in the map here, with independent food banks shown in blue and green, and in green are Trussell Trust food banks. But importantly, and as we just saw from the Spanish context as well, food bank stats underestimate the problem. And we know this from other countries, Canada being one, where there's been food banks in existence for a long period of time, as well as food insecurity monitoring. So in partnership with the Food Foundation and other third sector organizations, in 2016, we convened this workshop talking about why and how we should be measuring food insecurity to push forward change and policy action. And in general, although many different views were heard at this workshop, there was strong consensus on the need to campaign for harmonized measurement across the UK. I do want to flag that there were concerns about what measurement of food insecurity, the downsides of measurement of food insecurity. I can't discuss each of these, but things like the danger of segmenting poverty into different types, the fact that food insecurity is actually quite an extreme measure of poverty, and it actually lowers the bar for addressing wider poverty measures and social exclusion, and the potential for food insecurity measurement to lead to food bank responses, and also then limitations of the measurement tools themselves. But out of this workshop and working with someone who's working closely with the Food Standards Agency, we ended up with a measure of food insecurity being included on a nationally representative survey for the first time in 2016. Now, the Food Standards Agency, I think, could do this because they're kind of an independent government department. They're not led by a minister. So it was a bit easier for them to get potentially a political measure on their survey that they ran. One of the downsides of them taking the lead on this is that given government structure in the UK context, the Food Standards Agency only covers England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so it doesn't cover Scotland as well. But nonetheless, they selected a validated measurement tool. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, the United States Department of Agriculture Adult Food Security Survey module, using a recall period of 12 months. So this is what the module looks like, similar to the FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale. 10 questions that range in severity from worry about food running out, all the way then to mostly severe experiences of people not eating for a whole day, and then being asked how many months of the past 12 months they experienced that. I think it's important to highlight the operational definition of food insecurity that this measurement tool produces. So inadequate and insecure access to adequate food due to financial constraint. That's really what we're capturing here, and what we see as a key driver of food bank use. So again, slide from that we just saw in Anna's presentation as well. This measurement tool allows you to categorize food insecurity from mild experiences to then the most severe, based on the number of affirmative responses. So based on this measurement tool being added to the 2016 survey, we can see that in 2016, about 13% of adults were classed as marginally food insecure, just over 5% moderate, and then about 3% were severely food insecure. Now, as I mentioned, Scotland was not included in this measure. They chose from 2017 to use single items from the FAO's Food Insecurity Experience Scale. Measuring, again, worry about food running out and a couple of other indicators. So still at this point, although it was definitely the data from the Food Standards Agency gave us a picture of the scale of the problem in the UK, it wasn't a harmonized picture across. And I think the other limitation from both the Scottish Health Survey and the Food Standards Agency survey is that both of those surveys are surveys to measure health and food experiences. The Food Standards Agency particularly focuses on food safety and food practices. And when we think about food insecurity, we know that many of the drivers are really related to income and social protection. So again, working with third sector organizations and campaigning for better measurement across the whole of the UK, and through a series of many meetings with civil servants within the Department for Work and Pensions, and specifically the Family Resources Survey team, we achieved the food insecurity measure being added to the Family Resources Survey. And the reason this was so important for us is because this survey captures detailed income information, including access to state support. Now, the team from the Family Resources Survey chose to use the USDA tool as well, but they chose a 30-day recall period. And this is because other measures in their survey really focus on a 30-day measures such as income and other material deprivation measures. But this measurement now, which is going forward from 2019, has been going forward from 2019, has been used to monitor progress on the Sustainable Development Goal 2. So now we're having yearly reports being put out by the Family Resources Survey team, sharing prevalence of food insecurity across all 4 constituent countries of the UK and for the UK as a whole. From the survey data, they are also putting out prevalence estimates for different disadvantaged groups. So in particular here in the bottom right corner, I've highlighted food insecurity rates by ethnicity. So this data has been really important for showing just how wide the disparities are in food insecurity for certain groups, with people from Black, African, Caribbean, and Black British backgrounds having rates of food insecurity, this moderate and severe experiences of almost 20%. Compared to around 7% for people who identify as having a white ethnicity. I think the most important development from the measurement going on the Family Resources Survey is the ability of us to look at how food insecurity affects people on different sources of income. So, and then to potentially evaluate the influence of different policy changes on food insecurity rates. So here I've provided one example. Universal credit is a new income replacement benefit that was introduced on a phased basis since 2015 in the UK. And there's been a lot of controversy about how it supports people and its ability to support people. Shown in the blue here on the right-hand side of the graph, households receiving universal credit. In 2019, 56% of households receiving universal credit were food insecure. But an intervention was introduced as part of the COVID measures in 2020, adding £20 a week in benefit support for households receiving universal credit. And in the 2020 survey, we saw that the prevalence of food insecurity was significantly reduced. So we do need to do more evaluation of this policy change, but I think it shows the potential for this measurement to really inform policies that can make a difference to reduce food insecurity. I also just wanted to flag that the data that's been collected by the FSA has also now included measures of food bank use, and again just underscores the point of why food bank use doesn't even come close to capturing the true scale of the problem of food insecurity in the population. I wanted to raise a couple of measurement challenges. One is that we now have 2 different statistics coming out from 2 different sources. So we have the measure from the Family Resources Survey reporting that for the 2020, 7% of households were food insecure. And then the data from the FSA from a similar time period saying 16% of adults were food insecure. So wide discrepancy. And of course, this is because food insecurity is not chronic for many households. And when we delve into responses from the USDA scale measured over 12 months, we can see many households say that food insecurity experiences happen sometimes, but not often. or amongst adults who skip meals, they're not doing that every month, but some months, not every month, or 1 or 2 months of the year. And so when you measure food insecurity just on a 30-day basis, it is going to underestimate the prevalence. And that's why when reporting a measure for 30 days, it's so important to say that on average, every month, 7% of households are experiencing food insecurity. So we need to be really precise now with our language with these 2 different measures being available. So some things to keep in mind then, that methodological differences are going to lead to different measures. Things like what items are selected, whether or not you're also including physical access challenges to food acquisition, and then also different survey methods. So who are you speaking to? What kind of sampling methods are you using to capture your sample population, and who answers the questions? Importantly, for measuring progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, we need consistent measures and survey instruments over time. The other thing is that measurement, even though we can be talking about the same data, the interpretation can be very different, as can the use. So I just highlighted a couple of quotes that are coming out from the Family Resources when they're reporting on food insecurity. Most households were food secure, and only a minority of households were food insecure. Whereas I look at this data and think, oh my goodness, I can't believe how high that prevalence is. Their angle is obviously really different. And then they're also quick to point out that, it's only the most severely food insecure people with very low food security that would have substantive disruption to their food intake. Whereas, of course, we know that we need to be worried about people who are worried about not having enough food and that are making lots of changes to their diets because they don't have sufficient and secure income to ensure an adequate diet. The last thing is that measurement itself doesn't result in policy decisions. And when we were looking at kind of what the government is saying about its progress on sustainable development goals, the kinds of policies that they're putting forward to end hunger and achieve food security actually have very little to do with individual and household level access to food security. Which leads to my final point, and then turning over to Anna, is that measurement alone is not action to reduce or prevent food insecurity. And we really need ongoing advocacy to use the data to influence policy change. As a researcher, I'd say we also need to use this data to provide evidence of what policies make a difference. And we need to set targets for food insecurity reductions, and then policies that are tied to evaluating those policies to look at food insecurity outcomes over time. So I'll now turn over to Anna to pick up on these points.
Thank you, Rachel. I hope that's working okay. Thumbs up, Claudia. Great, fantastic.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing. Rachel's very well described the sort of backdrop of measurement of food insecurity in the UK and how the government is doing that. But one of the limitations of the national measurement of food insecurity is that the data takes a long time to gather and then to ultimately report. So there's quite a big time lag between the gathering of data and the reporting of it, particularly within the context of the Family Resources Survey, which Rachel talked about. So when the pandemic began in 2020, we were very concerned about the impact it was going to have on levels of food insecurity in the UK. So we set up a system of tracking food insecurity on an ongoing basis, using a similar set of questions that are used in the USDA scale. We captured not just economic access, but also physical access because of isolation and the challenges in the pandemic around accessing food physically. And during the course of that work, and we're still continuing it now, we've done 9 survey rounds. You can see here the timing of those rounds and the sample sizes and so forth, which vary a little bit from round to round. We're continuing this work now during the cost of living crisis, but it does give us an ability, because we've used the same approach each time, to be able to really understand trends. And this gives you, this next slide gives you a bit of a feel for the data that we've been generating. This is 6-month recall data. So back to Rachel's point about the time period that people are asked about experiences of food insecurity, and this captures moderate and severe food insecurity. So you can see that in the period up to January of this year, we had the highest levels yet of food insecurity at household level, with 10.8% of households experiencing it. We've actually got our 10th round of data in the field at the moment, and the early sight of that suggests that levels are continuing to rise. Now, the question is what you do with the data and how it's used, as Rachel said, for making change happen. We did a huge amount of work throughout the pandemic to draw attention to the data. In fact, there was a huge amount of media interest in the data. I think in 2020, we had something like 3,000 media hits with our data. I mean, it was very, very widely covered. These are just some of the different types of news coverage, and what we found is, you know, pre-pandemic, it was extremely difficult to get stories of food insecurity in the national press, particularly in the more right-wing or business press. That all changed during the pandemic, and we had interest right across the media spectrum, interest in the data and what it was telling us about the situation. Then in the summer of, early summer of 2020, something different happened. So we have a Premier League footballer in the UK who plays for Manchester United, and his name is Marcus Rashford. And he, as a child, grew up in food poverty, and he spotted our data in the press. And he wrote to MPs about his concern about the situation, and particularly drawing attention to the to children who were on free school meals but were at home because schools were closed during the pandemic, and were facing a summer holiday with no real protection in place, even in spite of the economic impact of the crisis. So he used our data to draw attention to the problem, and with his very, very big social media following, put a huge amount of pressure on the government. I mean, to the extent that the Prime Minister was phoning him when he was in the football pitch. Like, I mean, the Prime Minister was talking to him directly. Such was the extent of his voice in communicating the issues, and the power of his voice, and the fact that he was drawing on his own personal experience. So it was a very authentic voice. Up until that point, we had been doing a lot of work with this group of young people that you see here in this photograph, and several others who have come from disadvantaged circumstances themselves, and had been talking about their stories of food insecurity and the need for a stronger free school meals program in the UK. They'd been talking about that in the media themselves, and when they were able to team up with Marcus Rashford, we found that, of course, their voices became even more powerful. So that work was ongoing. There was a lot of pressure on the government to extend free school meals to children during the holidays. And then in parallel to that, we were working to try and engage with an independent review that government commissioned called the National Food Strategy, which had actually a very broad scope in thinking about how we transition the food strategy to deliver better health and environmental outcomes. But it made a set of recommendations in the summer of 2020 on food insecurity amongst children in particular, and recommended extending free school meals to more children, making sure that children on free school meals had support during the holidays, and expanding a scheme that was for preschool children called Healthy Start Vouchers, which provides vouchers for fruits and vegetables for families with very young children that are on a low income. And so then we worked very closely with Marcus, the footballer, to align behind these three recommendations. The report was commissioned by government, but it wasn't adopted by government. And so there was a lot of advocacy work needed to try and make sure that those recommendations were in fact adopted by the government. And Marcus was the front runner for that campaign. He convened a big task force from the business community, and we helped to convene a large number of civil society organizations. So we were all aligned behind these 3 recommendations. And one of the key campaign tactics which Marcus used was the creation of a parliamentary petition, which allows the public to demonstrate their support for these recommendations. And you can see there on the right-hand side what that petition looks like online. You sign up, you have to put your postcode because it's part of a kind of constituency. You have to be a voter in the UK in order to support the petition. And what was really extraordinary was that within a single week, we had more than 1 million signatures on this petition. It was the fastest growing petition, I think, ever in parliamentary petition. And the issue was headline news in the UK for about 8 days during the October half-term period of 2020. It was, it was the subject of parliamentary debates. 5 days we've written here. I think it was even longer than that it was headline news. And it's put a huge amount of pressure, as you'd expect, on the government, and thankfully resulted in some quite significant policy commitments. So first of all, the Healthy Start scheme, which I mentioned, was for preschool children. The government decided to increase the value of the voucher from £3.20 to £4.20. It added a significant amount of value to the voucher, which meant that it could go further. And in addition to that, the government decided to commit to a year-long investment in holiday provision for children on free school meals, a scheme that was up until that time was very small scale, only working in 17 local areas in the UK, in England, and then took it up to a nationwide programme costing about £200 million a year, reaching 1.7 million children. And that has now been subsequently committed to for 3 years. So this is now almost a permanent feature in the policy landscape in the UK as a result of some of this work. And then in addition to that, we've seen commitments in Scotland and Wales to make free school meals universal for all children in primary schools, which has been, again, a very significant step forward. We're still waiting for progress on this issue in England. There are many children who still miss out on free school meals because they're too poor. They're not quite poor enough to qualify. The threshold for eligibility is set very low. So that's the subject of a lot of campaigning work that we are still doing. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of how the data can then be kind of harnessed and translated into policy impact. I'll stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Anna. And we give the floor, to Denise Darnan, Deputy Director for Social Inclusion, Integration and Fight Against Poverty from the French Ministry of Health, who is going to make a presentation about how are developed public policies to tackle food insecurity in France. Thank you, Denise.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me clearly? Yes, all right. Yes. So I'll try to be quite short because a lot has been told by my fellow speakers and a lot very interesting. I'll tell you today a few words, mostly centered about policy making, with first a short description of how the food out system works in France. Then what is at stake when it comes to design policymaking and measure food insecurity. A few words then about how we try to shape new public policies at the national and the local level in France. And last, some words about the new tools we set up for measuring food insecurity. So first of all, and in short, if possible, how works the food health system in France. You have to understand that here the basis and the historical basis of food health in France is based on associations and non-profits. I won't detail all the figures that you have the PowerPoint here, but it's about 200,000 volunteers that are committed in the food health system in France with an estimated workforce value of €500 million. So that's a huge contribution from the non-profit system, and that's the oldest contribution on the sector. Alongside the non-profit, the local authorities, municipalities are also central and have a long-running role in organizing the food health system in France at a local level, and with an estimated expense that is over €200 million a year. Then I have to mention the weight of European funds that also contribute at about almost €100 million a year. So you can see the scales between a non-profit, local authorities, then comes European funds, and last but not least, the national state that I represent today. And we are not a first-line player historically when you consider food health in France. The national funds are about 16 million euros a year, sorry, with a special focus on fiscal incentives that are given to companies and private to support the non-profit system. That is a bigger part of the French system. So the main information here is that the state is not a frontline player historically. But that was the history. If you consider the last decade, you can see that the national government, just like in England, as we mentioned earlier, is called to play a stronger and stronger role in the food health system. First of all, in France, in the last decade, what has really changed is the link between anti-food waste and food health, with a really strong incitation to supermarkets and canteens to prevent food waste and giving food to the non-profits that will finally benefit to people in need of food health. So that's a strong orientation from public policies at the national level. And another strong orientation are the national plans directed towards food and nutrition on the one side, and food and health on the other side. And the most important information here that we had so far two plans, one mostly focused on nutrition and the other one on health. And we are now merging those two plans into one. And this is important considering what Oliver de Schutter told in introduction, that we have to practice and to develop cross-sectorial policies with our agricultural view, production view, economic view, solidarity view, health view. And it's also been mentioned earlier, it's an holistic approach that we have to develop. And this is clearly emerging in France as an orientation for our public policies. And I don't detail about this, but alongside food health, we have systems that provide food health indirectly, like a canteen, like in England, a free breakfast at school or in university. And I won't detail here the new trends developing because I don't have much time, sorry about it. Maybe one of the trends that I should discuss a little about, because it also refers to what Olivier de Schutter told earlier with what we call the food policy councils at the local level. We have strong development and strong national support to local food projects that try to gather all stakeholders on a territory, a city or multi-city level, with once again producers, canteens, agricultural field, distribution, transformation, and solidarity, around organizing the food system at the local level. This is important and really strongly developing. So this is an overview, but when it comes to policy making, I really would like to emphasize that knowing is the key. And just like in England or in Spain, you can see that back a few years ago, we didn't really have no system for it. And we're going, we're really improving, even though if we consider that the food system itself don't have a centralized system. Just like the figures for food help, for food banks in England, we have huge controversy the past years in France about how many people benefit from food help, and without one central system, a multiplicity of non-profits intervening and local authorities intervening in that field, we don't have a central system providing reliable figures. So we have to approach those figures from another point of view. What we can benefit from is either some great surveys that are conducted from time to time by public agencies, especially one public agency specialized in food security, or on the other hand, some regular data providing from food help non-profits, but with some limits on the reliance we can have on it. So as you can see, the range on food insecurity, the figures range really on a wide range. The only point we have no doubt about is that we have a wide gap between the number of people suffering from food insecurity, that is much higher than people who benefit from food help. Important to mention that when it comes to knowing, we have a quantitative topic that I already mentioned, but also a qualitative side to try to understand what are the profiles of the people, or the profiles change, what are the individual difficulties people meet. So even at the national level, having a quantitative approach of food insecurity is not sufficient. I won't detail here, it's been mentioned earlier, we have a strong correlation between the low income and nutrition-linked pathologies. It's just a focus on what qualitative data we can have about the effect of social and food insecurity. And I won't detail neither the profiles we can have about the people who benefit from food insecurity, but I can detail a little more another example of qualitative approach on a specific study and survey conducted by a private partner that tries to describe more precisely what are the profiles of the people benefiting from food help. On the vertical axis here, you can see either people benefit from time to time, or on the contrary, almost on a daily basis from food help. On the horizontal axis, you can have either a very strong dependency, you really strongly need this food help just to feed yourself, or on the other side, lighter dependence, stronger ability to avoid food help. And this enables us to have a profiling of the people benefiting from food help. The problematics, the topics we are confronted to when it comes to knowing food insecurity, we can wonder those questions at a national scale or at a local scale, and this is very important when it comes to policy making, because we can set up policy at the national level, but once again, local authorities have a key role, and they also need to know to be able to adapt their policies. Once again, quantitative versus qualitative, I've already mentioned it. Beyond just the measurement of food insecurity or food health, as mentioned earlier, there is a strong interest in a holistic approach. We have public versus private data topic. The public system of statistics can be very helpful, but as well as our partners, and especially all the non-profits that are committed into the food health system and produce their own data, their own surveys, their own studies. And we've seen today with the other fellow speakers that non-profits or universities can also be great contributor to knowing food insecurity. And last but not least, we also have to consider what data or what surveys we are able to produce punctually or on a recurrent basis, which is very important to drive policy, to know how things evolve from one year to another. Once again, why figures and data is important? It's because we have controversies in the public policy, and there is a strong link between what we learn from data, what we learn from surveys, and what we can shape into public policy. I won't detail over all the controversies we're facing, but the food help system in France is facing very high logistic costs. There is a matter of equality on the national territory. There is a strong dependency to the gift from supermarkets, canteens, or private. The environmental impact is not assessed and not evaluated. We have a quantity versus quality dilemma in the public policy, because we try to answer to the needs of a wide range of person, and at the same time we try to promote a higher quality of food. We have expectations for higher sustainability, for higher accessibility. We have a call for dignity of people and empowerment, and we need a healthier nutrition. So as you can see, there is a number of challenges, and maybe the only consensus about the need for a holistic approach. And when I mean consensus, it's consensus between public authorities and all the partners who are committed with in this field. And the first prediction of this consensus or holistic approach at the national level is the development of a specific conference uniting public and private stakeholders, non-profit, state, local authorities, private sector, agricultural sectors, in which we try to discuss the needs of the system. It's not a policy shaping exactly institution. The last word on the policies still come to the political decision, but we try to together to assess the system and to understand what works, what doesn't work, and in which direction we try to go. And this is very interesting because we put around the table stakeholders who are with various interests and various views on how the system should evolve. And it's very important that we have the same kind of development at the local level. You've mentioned, and Olivier de Château mentioned the local food councils, and there are real help to try to develop local knowledge and local policies. I think I'm already long and late, so I won't develop some fields about new organizations, and I will tell you a few words about new tools for measuring food insecurity. A very important orientation in France is that we can we have the backup of the public statistics system with various institutions and agencies which are highly committed, especially since the COVID crisis, that in France, just as in Spain and England, United Kingdom has put a strong emphasis on food insecurity. And so we have a stronger commitment of public agencies. And this led to a very strong outcome from my point of view, is that a regular survey conducted by the National Statistics Institute will have every year some questions about food insecurity. And this is the widest survey on poverty in measured in living conditions, and it's conducted with about 100,000 households every year. So It will give us a very reliable data and figures about how many households use food out system and are in a situation of insecurity. Most of it, we have to combine direct and indirect data. We have direct data on food out benefits, of amount of food that are given, of number of people that are in food insecurity, but we also have data about unemployment, typologies of housing and households that are strongly linked to food insecurity. So we have to take into account at the national level, but maybe even stronger at the local level, those indirect data that can portray a territory, its people, and approach the needs in food insecurity. I already mentioned the specific surveys about food health, nutrition, and health. The limits is that usually they don't come on a yearly basis. They're conducted every 6, 7, 8, 9 years because it's a high cost, it's a high investment. So we have to combine the statistics that come on a yearly basis and the specific surveys that come from time to time. Same matter at the local level, and one of the key for us from the national point of view is to bring back up to the local authorities, to the local non-profits, to the local representatives of the state in the territories. We try to develop a food policy with tools that they can use to have a better knowledge of food insecurity on that territory, on the food actors, food landscapes, and try to develop themselves as well. An holistic approach, and I think we have together here Justine Labarre from Montpellier, who could witness also what is developed at the national level in France. I hope I've been made myself clear. I've not been too long, and I stop here to make space for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Denis. Thank you to all the speakers. We have some time, limited time actually, for some questions. I give the floor to Claudia Magaña, who will moderate the time we have for the debate. She is lecturer also at the University of Barcelona and researcher on these topics too. And she's also co-author of the study of food insecurity in Spain. So Claudia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to everyone for being part of this space, this webinar. And well, I'll take into account all of the comments that you can see them through the chat, but there are two questions that arise. So I will read them and I will read them I will read one and then I'll let you answer them. And then we can read the other one so we can try to answer them in at least 10 minutes if it's possible. So there's a question from Molly that she says the focus of several presentations is food insecurity. Rather than the right to food, governments and charitable organizations may well be addressing food insecurity, but not using right-based approaches to do so. That's the case in the United States to a large extent. I'm wondering about policies in place to require right-based approaches to food insecurity and lack of sustainable food systems. I don't know if there is any chance to answer that question. And also, well, to the people, to the speakers, I can read the other question. I don't know if there's anyone who would like to answer this question.
I can start with a short answer. I agree with Molly. I mean, I think that in Spain, one of the issues is that we are so far away from understanding the experience of food insecurity that it has become kind of like the first step to actually know where we are at in terms of levels of food insecurity. But there is there is a lot of work to do around how then we tackle these levels of food insecurity and what does it mean to do it from a perspective centered people's dignity, in a rights-based approach. So I think we're just trying to start a basic conversation with policymakers and institutions saying this is an issue, we want to put this in the political agenda and also in the public agenda, that people are aware that this is happening in Spain, and also to elevate those voices and those experiences of people that are experiencing this situation. And also, I think from a perspective of we all have the right to adequate, to sustainable food, and trying to get that into more like a mainstream discourse. But I do totally agree with her that it's not the same just like working on food insecurity and the rights to food. But yeah, we're trying to walk that path, and we started from that basic measurements of, okay, where are we at with this?
Yes, Olivier?
Thank you, and I apologize for not using my camera. I have people behind me and it doesn't make this very convenient. I think it's extremely important to make a clear distinction between providing support in the form of food aid by charities, NGOs, food banks, food pantries, on the one hand, which is important, which may help families, and guaranteeing the right to food as entitlements people may claim, demanding from governments that they take action and that they leave no one without support. The reason why the distinction is important is because when we rely only on these stopgaps, food banks, food pantries, NGOs, the unsold food items from supermarkets being distributed by the charity organizations to families in need, people are ashamed, they feel stigmatized, and as a result, in many cases, they will not dare to request food aid, and the food aid they will be provided will be at the price of their dignity. And I think it is extremely important that we do not lose the point of Molly Anderson here, and that we realize that governments who, although no one starves on their territory, do not guarantee the right to food as a legal entitlement, are failing to comply with their human rights obligations. I think it's extremely important to make that distinction. And what does it mean? It means not just using the label of the right to food and having it, you know, appear many times on the official documents. It means accepting that people have rights they may claim before independent bodies, so that if they are not provided through either a job that pays or social protection that effectively protects or the ability to produce food by themselves in some relatively limited cases, then people should have a right to complain and to have someone enforce their duty on government. So I think it is a very important point.
Thank you, Oliver. I don't know if there is any other participant that would like to answer the question, the speakers, any of the speakers?
I could come in briefly if you like. Just two quick thoughts, and then I'm actually going to have to run and get a train. I'm sorry I can't stay longer, and I spoke way too long myself. So just 2 points. First of all, to recognize that the right to food is much broader than what I see as, you know, a bare minimum level of food security, which is what's being captured by these instruments, right? Like, we're talking about people being worried about just having any food to eat, enough food to eat, not about the quality of food they're eating, whether or not it's sustainable, you know, whether or not it's healthy. So I think the flip side of food insecurity measurement is when we see it in a population, then we know that we're not even close to actually recognizing right to food, because we're still even seeing these extremes in the population. In terms of rights-based approaches, I would highlight some of the work that's been done actually by some of the food aid networks in the UK, advocating for financial interventions to address food insecurity. So often food banks here do talk about their own limitations. They realize that it's not a rights-based approach, just giving free food away. And so they're some of the very strongest voices in terms of advocating for stronger social security payment, living wage. So I can pop a couple of links in the chat, some of the work by the Independent Food Aid Network, really advocating for cash-based approaches as actually a way that food banks themselves can also engage in advocacy for people to have the dignity to afford the food they need.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, there's another question we have that Alice wrote on the chat before. And then if there's any few minutes, I can allow you, Christopher, if you want to write the question you have, I will appreciate to write it there so we can get them together. So what Alice asked us before is asking for all of you is, she says, food policy councils in theory are meant to be representative of a diversity of sectors, public, civil society, community, business. So in this sense, should be well placed to addressing right to food? I believe this is a question more for Olivier, or I don't know if Dennis?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, Olivier, if you want to start, or I can just say a few words from French point of view. Obviously, I don't have a view on the opportunity to promote the right to food, but in the interest of solving the food insecurity matter, clearly we have to go into a holistic approach. So it means, on the one hand, addressing all the side of alimentation, which means production, transformation, distribution, economic cost for producer, economic cost for the buyer. And on the other hand, it means connecting all stakeholders, because it relies on a system, public, private, and once again, those who produce, those who consume. So I don't know if I really answered to your question, but in my view, it's really important that we connect actors, stakeholders, and all the sides of what alimentation is and the system.
I'll just jump in because there's not much time, so I'm sure everybody is kind of like having all this stuff to do. I just think in terms of Alice's comment, which probably with all her experience in the UK food partnership, she will be able to answer as well herself. But I think one of the things with food policy councils and food partnerships is that there are some like broad agreements around we're going to tackle inequalities, sustainable food, healthy food. But there's not, in many of them, there's not a clear commitment to to the framework of the right to food, or to other kind of like more direct, I think, values. And I think we're seeing this in terms of like how these spaces, these multi-stakeholder spaces where everybody has a voice, where everybody can say what they think, what their interests are, what their values are, like sometimes are very criticized because they don't have like a common set of values that are kind of like about pushing things further. For example, saying, okay, we're committed to the right to food, so we're working in this direction. And if you are a stakeholder that is interested about your returns around selling organic food maybe, or about selling kind of like conventional food, well, this is maybe not your space. So I do think there's something about how we link and we raise our ambitions in terms of like, okay, we're here to work together across different sectors, across different stakeholders, but our values are much more aligned that these broader kind of like, these broader umbrellas, no, what we call kind of like these conventions that now everybody shares. Nobody's going to say we don't want sustainable food anymore, so, or we want unhealthy food. So I think there's something around that, and maybe we should be pushing these spaces to be bolder in terms of their commitments to this type of frameworks from the beginning, so that we can actually move maybe a bit faster around those lines.
Thank you, Anna. I don't know if Olivier, would you like to add something else?
No, I think Anna has perfectly summarized this. I think once we invoke the right to food, we also bring on board all the institutions that protect human rights in general, that today are very separate from the food system actors. Courts, national human rights institutions, parliamentary committees that seek to assess whether the policies adopted in parliament are consistent with the human rights obligations of the state. All these institutions basically do not use the right to food in Europe. And that is a pity, because in a number of sectorial policies, the right to food has something to say and something to add. And I think alliances should be built between the food system actors on one hand and the many institutions that protect human rights on the other hand. And that alliance for the moment does not exist because of the lack of any reference to the right to food as guiding the commitments towards providing food to all the population in conditions that respect the dignity of each person.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for all of you, for your sharing and insights. And well, time is a scarce source, so I will give the word to Pili so we can close our webinar. And thank you all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take you for more time, because we have already it's 15. Well, we consumed the time. So just thank you to all the participants, to all the attendees for sharing your thoughts, your comments. It's clear to us that much work remains to be done to guarantee access to sustainable food for all, the right to food in general. And if we take the last intervention of Olivier, it's true that we started introduction talking about SDG 2, and I would like to finish talking about SDG 17, the need to foster alliance, to work together, to share knowledge, to join effort, and to mobilize resources to work together in this challenge. So thank you so much, and thank you for being here today with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you.
Everyone, thanks.